Well, hello everyone. I see Colleen and Carol on. I don't see Jan on yet.
It sounds on.
Yeah, hang on a minute. That wasn't such a good idea to turn my iPad on. All right. Let's see here. Yeah, I don't see Jan on there yet. She's out of town, Colleen and Carol. Jan is up in New England, I think with her dad. She took the stuff with her, and she said she was definitely going to be on tonight, but she may have gotten tied up. Well, I don't know. At any rate, I welcome you to WAY2B TV, where there is a better way to be than atheist or theist. This week I saw a friend in a restaurant who said, "I saw your show." And this is not something I expected, to have friends from my bridge club comment on the show in public. I wondered which one she saw. We're just getting started, and we're still pretty clumsy and unorganized. So I went home and I watched everything we've done so far. I mean, every video, every show, everything. And wondered what she might have seen. At any rate, our first show wasn't all that bad, I didn't think, but you could certainly see we were brand new. Our third broadcast showed a little hope for real progress, I think. But then there's that second one, that second show, where I went on like a fire hose of words. I hope that's not the one she watched. But anyway, I'm excited about what we are doing, and I hope you are too. Keep the chat room and Twitter room busy. And call on the phone if you like. No one's done that yet. I'm just glad you're here. And so I need to go through the contacts, and then we'll move on. We want your questions and comments. There are several ways to do this. First, callers can call 863-940-0047. Secondly, we have an active Twitter feed on screen throughout the broadcast. Just tweet hashtag WAY2BTV and the chat room is open. On a computer monitor, you should see the chat room to the right of your video screen. If you're watching a PC full screen, you will not see the chat room. You can interact with us in between shows by email at interact@way2b.org, and you can text the WAY to 22828 to receive our newsletter each Thursday morning. Each newsletter will have a direct link to the broadcast. The newsletter also contains the discussion starter videos we will be using that same Thursday evening. Finally, to receive direct notices each time we upload, please subscribe to our WAY2B TV channel on YouTube. It would help us greatly. Some of you all may not know, but YouTube actually uses the number of subscriptions as a way to decide how many privileges that you have related to YouTube. Those with more privileges and more views, with more subscriptions and more views, actually have more privileges on YouTube. And so to build the channel, it would help us very much to gain subscribers. Well, we do have Joni with us again tonight, and we're still working on that sound, like between Tennessee and Florida, like we've been working on. You have any words of wisdom for us, Joni?
No, except that I need to speak slowly.
I'll do my best.
No, I need to speak slowly.
Oh, you need to speak slowly. Yes. That's right. So your words don't run together. I did check the video this week after we did the show on Sunday afternoon, the private show, and your lips were still synced, and so were mine. So it's just a fluke, I think, what happened last week with the out of sync voices that I had to fix.
Nobody knows that but you.
Well, you might tell them about the message you got from a friend from high school.
Oh, go there and read it. A friend from high school said that the posts that I have been, or the videos that I've been posting to first Facebook that you've been doing, she's been enjoying it. You have a refreshing way of looking at things, and she wants me to keep posting them.
So where she live?
She lives in Texas.
In Texas. So we've reached out to Texas already. So that's
Right.
That's pretty cool. Colleen says her show's seconds. What is she talking about, Joni?
The pre-show, the countdown. Carol said that her showed it was still 30 minutes out, and she didn't think that was right. So I encouraged her to refresh her YouTube thing.
Yeah, she probably should refresh the screen because I'm looking at it on YouTube also. I've got my iPad open in front of me, and it's running fine. And so it's probably just you need to refresh the screen. I can't imagine why it would be that far behind, because that would have been 30 minutes ago.
We did some playing around with the timer, or she could have caught it in the middle.
She could have. Let us know if it fixed itself. The countdown is okay, she said. Colleen said the countdown is okay. Okay.
That doesn't mean it's okay with Carol.
Carol, let us know if the countdown is okay with you, if everything works for you. For the last 2 weeks, we've been developing some overall view of the background material related to the Kingdom of Heaven stories. And as we go forward for the next several weeks, we will be looking more in detail at each one. This week, we're going to lay a bit of a foundation for looking at these parables, and I've got a little intro video related to that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make 6 videos, and these 6 videos will go through each one of the Kingdom of Heaven stories that are in the ancient writers' writings from the New Testament, one by one. So you'll need to stick with us for a few weeks if you want to get the whole 11 stories in and know what I'm talking about. The video this week simply talks about what we're doing, how we're looking at the stories, and what are some of the considerations that we're going to make. And so you'll notice in the video that I talk about the considerations that I'm making when I look at each one of these stories. Did you say something, Joni? Okay. So let's watch the video and see where we can go from there. Having introduced a little background in previous videos, we are now looking in greater detail at each of the Kingdom of Heaven stories. My presentation of these stories for our discussion focuses on several aspects of each story. I would be very interested in your comments and questions regarding these 5 considerations before we move on. First, the biggest mistake we make, I think, is putting Jesus into what an ancient writer presents as one of Jesus' own parables. Secondly, to what does the ancient writer attribute each of Jesus' comparisons? To a person, to a thing, to an action, to an attitude, or to all of these, or none of these? Thirdly, with each story, at what point does the parable end and the ancient writer's commentary begin? Next, if the ancient writer proposes consequences, do these consequences refer to a literal place of turmoil, or to a mental state of turmoil, discontent if you will, being ill at ease? And can we separate the writer's proposition from the parable itself? Finally, do any of the stories bring up a wealthy afterlife, where one sees their loved ones, or is the Kingdom of Heaven simply metaphor for something else? It would seem there are 2 groups, most likely to respond dogmatically to the Bible. These 2 groups often use a parable, of all things, literally. A parable is by definition a fictional story, a metaphorical illustration, allegory if you will. The two groups who literalize the Bible most often seem to be the conservative Christian theist and the hard atheist. Each uses parable for the purpose of supporting what has become community indoctrination within their respective camps. Therefore, in our discussion, I asked both groups to consider carefully that whatever first century writers might have heard about Jesus' parables and what they tried to sell in their later writings might be very different. I also asked one group to resist the tendency to race to the supernatural, and the other group to resist the tendency to make Jesus a bumbling idiot. I think there is more here for both groups to consider, and without either atheist or theist switching camps. One must remember that whether philosophical or theological, atheist and theist are sibling rivals who share the same ancestry, one secular and the other one religious, and sometimes as kissing cousins. In case you didn't catch it, that was a parable. You are currently watching a video I used to summarize our discussion. I used 6 more videos to discuss the 11 Kingdom of Heaven parables in greater detail. And we discuss each in the same order in which the ancient writer related the stories. I will upload these videos as quickly as I produce them. You can find them in the For Heaven's Sakes playlist as follows. The first video includes the first 3 consecutive and related Kingdom of Heaven stories. I entitle The Life and Times of a Great Idea. It employs the germination of weeds, good seed, and leaven. Video 2 is the next 3 consecutive and related Kingdom of Heaven stories. I call it One Man's Trash is Another Man's Treasure. These 3 stories employ the search for the valuable and the sorting out of relative value. Then comes a single story, Forgive, but Don't Forget, related to one's response to paying it forward. And video 4, the 8th story, is named There Is No Payday Someday, a parable that explains there is no ticking time bomb related to some good decisions. The next to last video in the Kingdom of Heaven parables I call Let's Party. This 9th parable utilizes the concept of being too preoccupied to respond to even a great opportunity. We conclude the 11 Kingdom of Heaven stories with 2 consecutive and related Kingdom of Heaven parables. I entitle, You Just Wait Till Your Father Gets Home. These 2 parables communicate the need to prepare for spur-of-the-moment reactions. So don't be so serious. Let's try to have a little fun with it. It's no skin off my nose what you believe or continue to believe, or what you disbelieve and continue to disbelieve. By the way, that's another parable. Remember, we are looking at one ancient writer's rendition of Jesus' teachings, the only biblical writer to employ the figure of speech, Kingdom of Heaven. All right, so I would really like to have your comments related to the stories or the considerations themselves. And I fixed this a little slide here where we can kind of look at them together and talk about them together. The first one there, hey Jan. Jan's on there now, Colleen's on there, Joni's on there, Carol's on there. This is our crew. It's becoming our crew, isn't it? The very first consideration I put in the video was the first and biggest mistake we make, I think, is putting Jesus into what an ancient writer presents as one of Jesus' own parables. And I'll get away from the Kingdom of Heaven stories for a minute. Probably one of the best examples of that I know of is how many people have you ever heard say, Jesus said, as you do unto the least of these, you do unto me. But Jesus didn't say that. Did you know that? Jesus told a parable about a king. And he had these 2 groups of people. And he was talking to them about when he was hungry and when he was thirsty and when he was in prison and when he was sick and so forth. And the 2 groups didn't really know why they were in the 2 groups. One was One was considered to not have done as they should, and the other one was considered to have done as they should. And so, and neither group really realized while they were. And Jesus said, the king said, as you do unto me, the least of these, you do unto me. But Jesus didn't say that to anyone about himself. And I think that's very important. Now, you might say, well, when Jesus told his parables, he was the chief character in his parables. No, he wasn't. Read Jesus' parables and you realize not at all. I mean, his parables about everything. Men, women, all kinds of things. About leaven, about seeds, about all kinds of stuff. Jesus is not the main character in his parables. And when we put Jesus in his own parable, we make a different parable out of it. So this was not Jesus judging two groups of people as we've been taught most of our Christian lives. Jesus was teaching the concept of when people respond to things in life, their visceral response is what they respond with. And these two groups had done well and had done poorly based on their visceral response to certain things. And it was not about Jesus himself. Jesus' parables, I don't think were ever about him. I don't think you know of a parable that was about Jesus, where Jesus was telling a parable about himself. So that's really important as you look at parables. And I'd like to know your comments as we move through each one of these, because this is going to be what I use as evaluation as I make all 6 of these videos and we begin to talk about each one of the Kingdom of Heaven stories in detail. I'd be interested in anything that you think of that you say to yourself, well, maybe you should consider this, Elise, or you should consider that. And I would be more than happy to respond to that. Secondly, ask the question, to what does the ancient writer attribute each of Jesus' comparisons? To a person, to a thing, to an action, to an attitude, to all of those things, to none of those things, maybe to something else. But the point is we never quite think about the fact that when Jesus uses something to compare it to, whether it be a man going on a journey, or whether it be a man having planted good seed in his field, or whether it be 10 virgins waiting on the bridegroom, or whether it be some man who's entrusted his wealth to 3 different people and they use different amounts and they're waiting for him to come back, or whatever it happens to be, you need to ask yourself before you start analyzing a parable, what is it that the writer is saying Jesus compared the kingdom of heaven to, and not just launch out. And then finally, the third one is, with each story, at what point does the parable end and the ancient writer's commentary begin? And that is probably one of the most important questions there. Because as you read along in a parable, you might read a nice little story, and the story seems to end, and then you get so, and so it will be at the end of the age, and then blah, blah, blah. Maybe some supernatural comments. Then you have to ask yourself, if you're going to look at this thing from the standpoint of scholarship, you ask yourself, did the writer hear scuttlebutt related to one of Jesus' parables? We've just been retold what the scuttlebutt sounded like to that writer, and it didn't sound the same to all the writers. I think we know that already. But we've just found out what it sounded like to that writer, and now we've got to determine how much of what is on the end of it was in the original telling of Jesus, or in the scuttlebutt about the original telling of Jesus, and how much of it was that writer's commentary as he continues on with it, and some of it explanation of his own, some of it actually adding to the story. And so we don't really know, because we do know that as we go through the Gospels, that different writers tell the same stories, but they tell them differently. Well, why do they tell them differently? The scuttlebutt they heard was different, maybe. What they heard that Jesus is said to have said, because none of them heard Jesus. But if what they've heard that Jesus was said to have said, is that different? Or perhaps maybe they have taken the story that was going around and they're making a different point with it than some other writer. And as long as you can look at the Bible like that, then you can look at it in a way that you wind up in some and some place that is reasonable and well thought out and logical, instead of going to how do I make these two stories exactly the same. People have tried to harmonize the Gospels for centuries. And the truth is, we have 4 Gospel writers. Those 4 Gospel writers each had an axe to grind. Each was doing what they were doing. Each were talking about Jesus in a different way. And they were writing for different purposes to different audiences at different points in time. John 70 years out, Mark only 20 years out. And so, well, about 50 years out, I take that back. So, but the fact is they're writing at very different times and to different audiences and for different purposes. And so we have to ask ourselves about that. What happens when we harmonize the Gospels or try to make all the stories line up instead of looking at each one and trying to get out of each one what that writer was trying to do? But when we take all of them and try to put them together and make a story that would make sense, that is, well, maybe it's just different views of the story. Maybe it's just different ways. Maybe this happened, but that one didn't say it, and this happened, but that one didn't say it. And the way these two make sense doesn't seem obvious at first, but if, and one of my favorite ones of those is where Judas, how did Judas die? Well, supposedly Judas hung himself, committed suicide and hung himself. Well, that's in one place in the New Testament, but in another place in the New Testament, it says Judas fell down in a field and his bowels ran out. So then I saw a writer when I was in seminary at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. In the library, one writer had said that probably what happened was Judas hung himself. The branch was not strong enough to hold him. It broke. He fell into the field and his bowels ran out. And you've got to realize that what you're doing is you're simply making up a new story. That's all. And so when we try to harmonize the Gospels, what we're really trying to do, what we really wind up doing, whether we are trying to do it or not, but what we really wind up doing is we wind up simply making a 5th Gospel in essence. We wind up making a different story. Jan wrote, "What do you mean that each Gospel writer had an axe to grind?" Well, each Gospel writer was doing something different. And no one can read Mark, which was the first Gospel written, and then read John, which was the last Gospel written, and not see that John was trying to do one thing with Jesus and Mark was trying to do something else with Jesus. Mark had a very different Jesus than John did. And Mark had this humble Jesus that wouldn't tell anybody about miracles. We talked about this a week or two ago, or maybe last week. And had this Jesus that wouldn't perform a sign for the scribes and Pharisees. And John had this Jesus that was showing off and saying, when you've seen me, you've seen the Father, and so forth. And so, very different purposes, very different purposes. I think all the way through it, though, we have Gospel writers and New Testament writers of all kinds who are trying to build what the Christian religion is going to be. Even Luke at the beginning of his Gospel says, it's my lot, having known all that happened and so forth. It's my lot to tell a more perfect story than Mark did. And so when you get right down to it, there may be even a little bit of competition between them. The further out they got, but they all had their own axe to grind. They were all trying to do something different with a different audience at a different time, and they were all trying to do it in a different way. In other words, I don't see the Gospels as something where we have this inerrant, infallible, perfectly consistent Word of God, inspired Word of God thing, because obviously it's not. It is very easy to look in the Gospels and see mutually exclusive alternatives of the same thing. The account of coming down the road from Galilee when the disciples were supposedly arguing over which one of them is the greatest, and coming into the house in Capernaum, and Jesus asked them, "What were you talking about on the road?" And in one gospel it says they got silent. They got completely silent and didn't want to answer because they didn't want him to know they were arguing about which of them would be the greatest. But then another gospel says they came into the house in Capernaum and they went up to Jesus and asked him which one of them was going to be the greatest. And so when you get right down to it, both things cannot possibly be true. And yet I do know many people who would try to convolute some story together that would make both gospels possible within the same instance. And they're just simply not. They're two writers doing two different things in two different books at two different times and two different audiences. And that's just how that works. The next question is, you have any other questions about it, just pipe in. I'm watching the chat room and be more than happy to try to address whatever. Let's see here, where were we? The fourth consideration that I have in mind for these videos, these 6 videos that I'm making is, and this is a very important one, if the ancient writer proposes consequences or proposes a result, if you will, to the parable, something, in other words, what's going to happen as the result? Do these in the parables where we see this, what we see is this turmoil, this place of turmoil, the gnashing of teeth, it'll say sometimes, and so forth. Well, if they propose that, are they referring to a literal place of turmoil or to a mental state of turmoil, discontent, being ill at ease? And can we separate the writer's proposition from the parable itself? In other words, can we look at that sentence and say to ourselves, well, let's see, was this part of the original story that Jesus told, or is this something the writer added on to the end? Because it's always on the end, right on the end. And in other words, is this part more of trying to build the Christian religion? And it talks about this place of turmoil. We know they were not talking about hell. What they could have been talking about Sheol, because they had this idea that their enemies would go to a Sheol, a place where they would have a bed of maggots with a blanket of worms. That's in the Old Testament. And they thought that their oppressors would become slaves when the kingdom of God came and Messiah ruled, and then they would be rich on earth. However, they don't. They were not talking about hell. And obviously it doesn't say hell also. But is it a place of turmoil? Is it a state of turmoil? Is it an attitude of turmoil? Is it a matter of ill at ease, discontentment, so forth? In other words, this ain't going to make you happy, that kind of thing. And so I think we have to ask ourselves that. And you may come to different conclusions than I do, and that's fine. Let's see. Colleen says, I think everyone has their own personal Jesus, as in we can or do view him in our own way. And yes, I'm sure that's true, Colleen. Because mostly our Jesus, or especially if you were raised in the church, and I'm assuming you all were, I'd be interested in knowing, but I'm assuming you all were. But if you were raised in the church, then you formed your view of Jesus from the scuttlebutt of the church. You formed it from the Sunday school sound bites and the Christian cliches and the Bible buzzwords that were used in your church as you were growing up, and in the various churches that you've gone to as you grew up. And so you formed this impression of Jesus, if you will, that probably did not come from a lot of study or a lot of deep contemplation about it, but rather most of us, I know I did, I've always thought of Jesus as he was this good guy who thought we should love one another, and that the 2 greatest commandments is love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, and the second is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. And that it was a matter of Jesus was trying to get us to be the kind of people who would help each other and love each other and be at peace with each other. And that's kind of how I thought of Jesus. I never took the supernatural aspects of it too much to heart when I was growing up. Joni and I were talking about this week. Tell them, Joni, what you said about the escalation of Jesus' changing attitude within the Gospels, and how you noticed that as a child, but you thought of it in another way. Talk about that.
Well, I was reading the Bible, or hearing the Bible taught like I would a novel or any other kind of sequential book. When I realized that they were trying to start at day one and go to day, the last day of the 3 years, and what happened after that, it still didn't hit me until you said something about the different Jesus that was in Matthew as opposed to the Jesus that was depicted in John, and how his particular personality had morphed. I never saw that. I thought that he started out being very quiet and humble, and as his tenure on earth came to an end, he was less careful about who saw what, who heard what. He wanted to bring things to a head. And that was his purpose in life, was to become an enemy of whoever and wind up being crucified and killed.
Yeah, and then you realize that, and she and I talked about it a lot this week, but she said it was one of those aha moments for her. But when you look at the Gospels, you're not looking at a progression of Jesus' life. You're looking at each one, and you use the phrase, what dawned on you was each one was saying, no, this is the story. No, this is the story. No, this is the story. And
kind of like they were arguing about what happened.
Yeah, and in reality, that's exactly what you have, because each one of them is writing about that same 36 months of time, all right? Each one of them is writing about that same 3-year ministry. Each one of them has the crucifixion in it, although Jesus don't die on the same day and every time. Every one of them have, an awful lot of what it is. It's a lot of overlapping information about that same period of time. It's not a progressive, I'll write about this the first fourth, now you write about the second fourth, you write about the third fourth, and then you write about the fourth fourth, and we'll call them 4 Gospels, and they make up the whole. That's not at all what you have. Not even close. Do you have something else, Tony?
It seems like there was no collaboration between them. And that's explained by the fact that they were years and years and years apart. The fact that our class reunion is this weekend, 45 years. Most of those people I haven't seen in 45 years. It's not like they keep in touch with each other, even though they were supposedly preaching and teaching the same thing. How old was John when he was killed? We don't know that. But it doesn't seem like there was any cooperation between the gospel.
Jan asked you a question. Look at the chat room. Jan also said, I think it was mental turmoil, which is horribly worse than physical turmoil. I think that's basically what Jesus was talking about in general. And I don't think it's reflected as well in the Gospels or in the New Testament as it could be. But it seems like once you study the Sermon on the Mount carefully, you study the comments he had about practicing religion carefully, and you study his Kingdom of Heaven stories carefully, and his other comments on the Kingdom of Heaven, what you discover is it sounds more like he's talking about contentment and turmoil than he's talking about anything else. He's talking about this makes you happy and this makes you sad. And so I think that may be true. I tend to lean in that direction, that what Jesus might have been talking about, I'm talking about the actual Jesus in the actual day that he spoke, not the Jesus necessarily as perfectly depicted in the Bible, because the Bible was written long after he lived, and it was written for the purpose each writer wrote. Do you see
Jan asked me a question.
Yeah, did you see Jan's question?
Yes. Well, is it more that Jesus changed or the writers? I think it must have been that the writers changed, because immediately after those, according to Scripture, immediately after the crucifixion, they all hid. They all were hiding and didn't want to be killed also. And maybe it took some of them 20 years or 30 years or 40 years to say, they're not going to do anything to me now. I can say whatever I want to.
Well, I don't think that those writers were people who knew anything about that. They were not people who knew Jesus.
You don't think they were present, huh?
No, because like we talked about before, those were Greek-speaking, educated people. They wrote well and they were educated people. Jesus's buddies and his disciples, his apostles, whatever you want to call them, those individuals were Aramaic speaking, uneducated, poor people. And it's just very unlikely. Now, I've heard people propose that, well, maybe they caught up with somebody that they could dictate to, and that person they dictated to, and so forth, wrote it down, and that kind of thing. And if that were so, I would think it would be clearly reflected in the writings. The reason we know that Paul used scribes is because it says so. You know?
Yeah.
It's not someone's intuition. It's actually there, and it says so. So, no, there's no sign of anybody dictating anything to anyone else. Those writers wrote on their own, I think, and they were not running buddies of Jesus. I do think what you're saying is true from the standpoint of, the Bible reflects that they hid and that they ran away and so forth. These were not individuals who were going, no, Jesus is the Son of God. We're gonna put up a fight, and we're gonna be right there, and we're gonna protest and so forth. These were people who were scared out of their minds, most likely, that they'd be crucified also. And so I think as time went along, the story spread, and the gospel writers wrote what they wrote. And my question has always been, there's no way that I can know that any part of the real story is still there, or that that a huge portion of it is the real story. But what I think is that, what I wonder is obviously they could not be. If you were telling a story that about George Washington or Abraham Lincoln right now, could you be sure that some saying of George Washington you've heard all your life, or some saying of Abraham Lincoln you've heard all your life, or whatever? In the reading that I've done, for instance, there's even some confusion over which one of them chopped down a cherry tree. Okay? So when you get right down to it, we can't really know how much of what they remembered was real close to it. I do believe that stories and sayings and particular types of teachings that Jesus used over and over and over would be the most likely thing to be remembered. It would be the most likely thing to be remembered, and if the contiguous line of thought is there, it's going to be in all that. It's not going to be it's probably not going to be at all in some supernatural story. Well, the fifth consideration, let's see. The fifth consideration I have down there is, finally, do any of the stories bring up a wealthy afterlife where one sees their loved ones? Or is the kingdom of heaven simply metaphor for something else? And that's pretty easy to go through in a way, because the first story is, let me see if I can find it here. That very first story, let me see, I don't know if I found it yet or not. Oh, I'm on the wrong one. Okay. Here we go. There we go. That very first story, the very first three stories, which are told in a row together. There's no sentences between them. They're just one story told in one series, without anything in between. One is a man planted good seed in his field. One is the mustard seed grew to a tree and provided shelter for everyone. And one is the leaven infected the whole batch once it was introduced. But obviously, those stories do not mention in any way whatsoever, not even an inference of an afterlife kingdom. And we're going to go through each one of these stories about the good seed getting corrupted and what the man said to his servants they needed to do about it and how it was going to be handled, about the mustard seed and what that means, and about the leaven and what that means. And that's why I call it the life and times of a great idea. Jesus simply started by just saying, there's a way that ideas are handled and a way that they grow. Okay? And then the next one the second video I call One Man's Trash is Another Man's Treasure. And it's about treasure that was buried in a field, and the man sold all he had, would sell all he had in order to buy the field. It's about fine pearls, and the man would sell all he had in order to buy the pearl. It's about a dragnet cast, and it's brought back into shore, and some fish are kept and some fish are thrown away. And we'll get into what those things mean. But again, is there any inference of a kingdom of heaven in that? Of a beyond the clouds, wealthy afterlife in that where you see your relatives? No, it's nothing there. We're at six out of the 3 stories right there, just to get that far.
It does infer a judgment.
Huh?
Go back to the other one. It does infer some kind of judgment at the end of life. Go back to video 2.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean,
so it will be
yes,
at the end of the age.
Exactly, and that was the question. The question before this one was, can we separate the writer's proposition from the parable? I mean, that parable says, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a dragnet cast into the sea and gathering fish of every kind. And when it was filled, they drew it up on the beach, and they sat down and gathered the good fish into the containers, but the bad they threw away. Okay? Now, stop right there. Is that the end of the parable? Because Jesus told parables. He didn't explain them.
Well, true that.
All right, so it will be at the end of the age, the angels will come, supernatural, and take out the wicked from among the righteous, and will cast them into the furnace of fire. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Have you understood all these things? And so I have to ask myself, how much of that is Jesus and how much of it is the writer? You have to ask yourself that too, and you can answer it for yourself. But the point is that it's not talking about judgment at the end of life. Where's the word life in there?
End of the age, not life.
Well, the end of the age, and we'll get into that in the video, but that actually has a meaning in Scripture. And it doesn't mean the end of life. Okay?
Okay.
So the end of the age. But at any rate, then it talks about angels and about burning up in a furnace of fire and so forth. And doesn't that sound an awful lot like just supernatural things being introduced into a story that's already there? And that's the way you'll see it. You'll always see it separated. And I've said that before. I don't know if y'all remember that or not, but I've said it before. You'll see Jesus' teaching, and then you'll see supernatural. And you will never see the supernatural intermingled with the teaching. Jan says, I would like to believe that I could go to wealthy afterlife and see all my relatives. How wonderful that would be. Unfortunately, I just can't seem to go there. And neither can I, Jan. I don't really think that's the answer. Now, I have heard people, there's a lady named Julia Sweeney who is a comedian. I don't know have you all seen the TED Talk that she did? I don't know. But Julia Sweeney said, she said the Mormons had come by and they said that when she died, she would go to be with all her relatives again. And she said, oh, because she doesn't like her relatives. So when you get right down to it, that could be a threat, not a promise. Anyway, so it's interesting to me, though. But that is what the church is basically taught. You're going to be wealthy, and you're going to go see your relatives again. But you got to ask yourself. So that's a great example right there, in video 2 at the end of the age. But we'll get into that deeper as I develop them. We're going to go through them one at a time, and we're going to spend time on each of these 6 videos, and we're going to go at your pace. We may cover more than one in a night. We'll go at whatever pace you want to go at. That's not a problem. Let's see. And then the fellow that forgave the king who forgave his slave the amount that he owed, and then the slave went out and to another person treated them horribly and wanted the money. Said, you better pay me right now, and all that. And the king found out about it, and he got mad and all that. And so it's a story about pay it forward. The guy was not able to pay it forward. And so obviously we'll talk more about that later. But again, there is no rich afterlife seeing your relatives in that either. And all you have to do is just read it and realize at the end of that one, the comment is made, and this is Joni. Here you go.
Okay.
Because he said to the slave, I had mercy on you, and as his Lord moved with anger, handed him over to the torturers until he should repay all that he owed. Okay? Then the writer writes, so, see that? There's that so again. So shall my heavenly Father also do to you if each of you does not forgive his brother from your heart. Okay? And so, as in, we're going to be tortured and tormented and so forth if we don't forgive. There may be some metaphorical truth in that I don't know of very many unforgiving people who live their life in an unforgiving state who don't wind up really not making themselves any happier. I don't know if anybody by holding a grudge has made themselves happier. You know what I mean? That doesn't add up to happiness. Jan wrote, I have my relative's DNA, so my relative's spirits are within me. And we talked about that last week. As long as there are people whose lives you've affected, you live on. I hope Joni and I live on in our children's lives for some time. And I hope we live on in their children's children. But there'll come a point. I mean, I can remember my father and mother very well. I can remember my grandfather and grandmother on both sides very well. I can even remember my great-grandfather, but not my great-grandmother very well on one side, and I can remember another great-grandmother, but not my great-grandfather very well, although I can kind of see him in my head. But the point is that as the generations get further and further, then if you go to great-greats, I'm kind of lost at that point. And so I think what Joni said about how you live on is true. You live on for about as long as the impact that you had, because that impact just keeps filtering down to the next one and the next one. So, at any rate, as we go through these, then there is no payday someday, and this is kind of a tongue-in-cheek title. Has anybody ever heard of Payday Someday? Any of you all ever heard of Payday Someday? Payday Someday is the title of a sermon preached by Billy Sunday. And that sermon scared the hell out of the audience. Because he said, you're all going to pay someday. Okay? There's going to be a payday someday. And it was a long sermon, and it was one of the most famous sermons ever preached. But this was the hiring of the laborers. And I think what I'm saying there is that what the parable says is that they were paid the same, even though they came at different times of the day. Everyone gets the same results out of going the way, out of being in the way. The same contentment comes to them. If they wait late in the day, it may come late in the day, but when they come to it comes to them. And so I think that it makes a lot of sense. So anyway, we'll get into that one more also later. I don't want to explain each parable right now. Because then I won't have anything else to do. I need to have more to do later on. And then I call the one about the wedding feast, let's party. Because he makes the invitation and a bunch of people turn him down. And then the parable goes on to say that even though they turned him down, the second invitation went out, and those people, they invited everyone, both of good reputation and bad reputation. I love that phrase that's in that parable. Because they said that people of both good reputation and bad reputation came to the wedding. Both good people of good reputation and bad reputation come to the WAY2B too, by the way. It doesn't really make any difference what society thinks of them. The cure for what society thinks of you, and many of us are marginalized, but it doesn't matter what society thinks of you. It's a matter of your way of being having everything to do with whether or not you're content in life. Not what everybody else thinks of you. And so I thought it was interesting. Those of good reputation and bad reputation were invited, and they came. And then that sixth video is, you just wait till your father gets home. There are actually two videos and two parables in this video. One is the 10 virgins, and the other one is the talents. And so in both cases, you have people who are preparing for someone else to come. They don't know when they'll come. And then they have to be ready with their visceral response for that person that comes. And it's kind of an interesting parable to me. Both parables are very interesting parable to me. And of course, we make them about the failure of people. Look at the talents sometime between now and the time we get there. Read the story of the talents and then read in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus talks about those who are least in the kingdom of heaven and those who are greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Read both of those, and then he talks about your righteousness needs to be better than the scribes and Pharisees, or you won't even know the kingdom of heaven. So, if you read all that together, you realize the contiguous line of thought of Jesus would tell you that what he's saying is those who have a little bit of the way get a little bit of results, and those who have a lot of the way in them get a lot of results. And it just makes perfect sense to me. So, any rate, that's what that's about. We're down to about 8 or 9 minutes. Jan, you're not saying anything else. You're supposed to talk a lot. You're the one that talks a lot. Let's see here. Where'd Carol go? I hadn't heard from Carol again.
I think she may have lost it when she was 30 minutes till time.
I think maybe
she didn't respond again.
No, she didn't. She was having trouble with her iPad, and I think she dropped off. Nope, I don't see her. I do not see her. Okay. Jan says, I'm really looking forward to these upcoming videos. Yeah, we'll probably argue about them a lot. Because the thing that I want to caution everybody about is bringing the preconception to the table. If you see a certain thing in it only because you've been told that that's what it is, then it's difficult then to discuss it, because what you really need to do is you need to ask yourself, can I look at this in a new way? Can I look at this and ask myself those questions? Is some of this the writer, and is some of it really part of what they were saying that Jesus said about these parables? Is some of it really the stories that got repeated, and some of it what the writers added to it? I think is a very, very important question as time goes along.
Well, it was written in such a way to accomplish what it has accomplished.
Say what, Johnny?
It was written and presented in such a way to accomplish what it has accomplished. And it's to herd sheep, not to provoke thought.
Well, yeah, yes and no, but it's thought is kind of up to the thinker. You can think.
But we've been taught not to think. We've been taught not to doubt.
Right. I had a theology professor in seminary who said, now, you weren't called to Jesus by reason. You weren't called to think about God by reason, but you're not to be unreasonable. And you weren't called to God by logic, but you're not to be illogical. And on the way home, me and my running buddies, and you remember who they were, Joni, a medical doctor, a NASA scientist, an ex-car dealer. We were all second career people. And on the way home from the class, we just all laughed and looked at each other and said that was the biggest bunch of hooey we ever heard in our lives. Be logical, don't have faith by logic, but don't be illogical, and don't have faith by reason, but don't be unreasonable. The truth is that it just depends on how old you are when you go to seminary, how much you think. The young Bible school students were following the professors around like puppy dogs and just hung on every word. The older students, like me and my friends, we were second career people who'd already raised families and were there because we had an interest in being there, and we already had developed the ability to think for ourselves. And it just makes for a different student, and that's who we were.
Check the chat.
Colleen says, being raised Roman Catholic, the church seemed to tell more of the horrible things that could happen. Well, absolutely, because by and large, religion operates through intimidation and through the promise of something that isn't going to happen until you can't prove whether it did or not. She said then the good also could come about. She said,
I think it's one sentence separated.
yeah, being raised Roman Catholic, the church seemed to tell more of the horrible things that could happen than the good that also could come about. Oh, herd and terrify into a behavior. Yeah, sure. You go a certain direction and you begin to act a certain way and do a certain way because you're afraid not to. Jan says, can we really tease out Jesus' line of thought? My guess is no. My guess is no. But
That's why it always comes back to that contiguous line of thought in what is known as the Sermon on the Mount. He doesn't deviate from that line.
Well, let's put it this way. I decided 15, 20 years ago that I was going to try. Okay? I was going to try my best to figure out if anything was there, if there was enough there to figure out what could the contiguous line of thought of Jesus have been that caused him to have such a following, then what was it? And so that's how I got to where I'm at. But as far as the Bible is simply not a history book. It's just not. And the New Testament especially is not a history book. The reason we have such great history today is because there were documents and a Library of Congress and all kinds of tools there in place as the people that we write history about today lived. And we were able to then gather that information and go back into those archives and come to conclusions that were much more likely than we're trying to study some books that were written from scuttlebutt, word of mouth, half century after the events they're writing about occurred. That's some pretty hard to put together writing. Coming up with actual concrete evidence in that case is very difficult. And so no, I don't think that we have the tools and the things in place it would take to actually come up with something I would even begin to call history. But we might be able to determine, especially if you make one assumption, and I know some of you don't want me to make this assumption, but I make it. And that is, I start with the assumption that says the supernatural doesn't happen. Now, if the supernatural doesn't happen, and I set the supernatural aside, what is left? And what did it say? And that's kind of what we've got. That's where this is coming from. It's coming from that which Jesus taught, not from walking on water or turning water into wine or raising Lazarus from the dead or any of those sorts of things. It's coming from what he wanted the people who were listening to him to know. And so that's where that's coming from. And so when a writer breaks off from a parable and starts talking about people burning alive in furnaces, my ear gets deaf, you know? I begin to say to myself, well, there's a piece of the folklore that got blended in. There's a piece of the stuff that got piled in on top of whatever it was that caused Jesus to have a following. That wasn't it, because the supernatural doesn't happen. And for some of you all, I know it's not that easy, and it's not that kind of a thing. And a lot of people believe in the supernatural, and it serves a place in their life. So, anyway, that we're going to have to end on that note because the hour is up. And anybody got a parting word? I see. Colleen says same thought line. I'm not sure exactly what she meant by that. I think she was responding to Jan. Huh?
Yeah.
Huh?
I think so too.
Yeah, she was responding to Jan. Yeah, that's one of the things that I will apologize for. Sometimes I get on this chat room and y'all say something, I respond to it, and I'm way off base because y'all are having a different conversation than I spotted. So, and that's too bad, but that's the way that happens sometimes. So, at any rate, let me take us to the credits, and I love y'all and thank you for coming. And Jan, I hope your trip goes well up in New England, and thank you for taking the time to be on. I hope everybody's okay up there and your dad's doing well. So let's go to credits. Thank you very much.